So, you want to own Dunder Mifflin, a mid-sized regional paper distributor headquartered in a business park in Scranton, Pennsylvania, selling a product that the entire rest of the world has spent 20 years trying to stop using. Most people watching this company assume it survives on nostalgia, on loyal customers who simply prefer the feel of a printed page. That is not what keeps this company alive. Dunder Mifflin is not a nostalgia business. It is a company standing on the very last piece of ground the tide has not yet reached, selling into a market that is not shrinking gently, it is being deleted, one email attachment at a time. So before you buy this branch, let us find out what it actually costs to sell paper for a living, and why the office that seems the least essential in the building is the only reason the company still exists at all.
First, correct your picture. This is not a mill, and it is not a stationery shop. Dunder Mifflin is a business-to-business distributor, a middleman that buys paper in bulk from manufacturers and resells it to offices, print shops and schools across a regional territory. The company runs several branches, Scranton among them, each one a small standalone sales operation with its own staff, its own local customers and its own numbers to hit. It does not manufacture anything. It does not own a forest or a paper machine. Its entire value is logistics and relationships, knowing which local business needs how much £20 stock delivered by Thursday and being the company that shows up. Understand what you are buying, not a factory, a regional sales and delivery operation, selling a single, static, increasingly unfashionable product.
Start with the size of the thing, because a single branch is genuinely small. A regional paper distribution branch in this class does something in the range of $8 to $12 million in annual revenue. Call it 10 million. Paper distribution is a low-margin trade. Wholesale cost, freight, warehousing, and thin competitive pricing eat most of the top line, leaving an operating margin typically between 3 and 6%. On 10 million in sales, that is somewhere between $300,000 and $600,000 of annual profit. That is the entire economic output of the branch you are looking at buying, before you have even asked the harder question, which is whether that number is stable, growing, or being quietly hollowed out from underneath by a trend nobody in the room particularly wants to discuss out loud.
And it is being hollowed out. Global paper demand for office and printing use has been declining for 2 decades, as email, cloud storage, and digital signatures replace what used to require a ream and a filing cabinet. Industry figures put that decline at roughly 2 to 4% a year, compounding, which sounds modest until you run it forward. A market shrinking 4% annually is worth roughly a third less in 20 years, with no floor guaranteed. A branch selling $10 million of paper today is, on the same customer base and the same pricing, plausibly selling 6 or 7 million in 2 decades, and that is before you count competitors doing the exact same arithmetic and fighting harder for a shrinking pool of orders.
Now understand why the margin is only 3 to 6% in the first place, because it explains everything else this company does. Paper itself is a commodity. Any distributor can source £20 stock from the same handful of mills, which means price is the primary lever customers compare, and price competition compresses margin toward the floor. On top of that, physical distribution is expensive. A fleet of delivery trucks, a warehouse, a sales team driving a territory, and a fulfillment center processing orders all have to be paid for out of that thin margin before a dollar reaches the owner. A distributor is not selling paper so much as it is selling the promise of a truck showing up on time, and that promise is expensive to keep, in a category where the product itself has almost no ability to justify a premium price.
And thin margins in a shrinking category attract a very specific kind of competitor. Large national office supply chains can source paper at a scale a regional distributor cannot match,
and absorb a loss on paper specifically to win the rest of an office's purchasing. That is not hypothetical for this company. A corporate buyout of Dunder Mifflin by a much larger national chain becomes a live threat precisely because the branch cannot defend its margin against a competitor willing to sell paper near cost as a loss leader. A regional distributor's only real defense against that kind of predator is not price, because it will always lose a pure price war against a bigger balance sheet. Its only defense is something a national chain's call center cannot replicate at any scale, which is a genuinely personal relationship with the person who signs the purchase order.
Put a number on that call center, because it explains exactly how thin the margin war really is. A national account rep working a phone queue can service several hundred small business accounts at once, spread across an entire region, at a fully loaded cost of perhaps $60,000 a year. A local branch rep, by contrast, might personally manage 30 to 50 accounts at a broadly similar salary. On cost per account alone, the national model wins by a factor of 10 or more, which is exactly why a pure price comparison always favors the larger competitor. The only way a local branch survives that arithmetic is if its far more expensive, far less scalable relationship with each customer is worth more to that customer than the difference in price, which is a bet the branch is making on every single account every single year. And there is one more line on the sheet that rarely gets discussed because it looks like a footnote and is not. Paper distributors in this category typically bundle office equipment servicing, copier maintenance, toner supply, printer repair, alongside the core paper account. Equipment servicing carries a gross margin often 2 to 3 times higher than paper itself, sometimes above 20%, because it is technical labor rather than a shipped commodity. On a typical branch, service and toner can quietly contribute a third or more of total gross profit, despite being a small fraction of revenue. Paper is the reason the sales rep is in the building. It is very often not the reason the branch is still profitable. Now, look at when that revenue actually arrives, because a paper distributor's year is not smooth. Back-to-school ordering in late summer and fiscal year-end purchasing in December and January typically account for a disproportionate share of annual volume, sometimes a third of the year's sales inside 2 short windows. Miss a delivery date in either window, and the branch is not just losing one order, it is risking the account for the following year, because a client burned during their own busiest season rarely forgets it. A branch manager tracking client happiness and small workplace dramas in the quiet months is, whether he frames it that way or not, maintaining the relationship capital that has to be spent down hard the moment those 2 narrow windows open, when there is no room left for error.
Which is the reveal. The reason this branch survives at all is not the paper, it is the relationship. A sales rep who knows an office manager by name, remembers their daughter's soccer season, and personally handles a botched delivery is providing something a national account line cannot price into a spreadsheet. That relationship is what keeps a mid-sized local print shop ordering from Dunder Mifflin instead of switching to a national chain that is nominally 2% cheaper. The entire office you are watching, every birthday party, every prank, every mundane afternoon that looks like it has nothing to do with selling paper, is in fact the retention mechanism keeping the branch's customer base from bleeding to a lower-cost competitor. The product is commodity. The relationship is the actual moat.
Put a number on what that retention is actually worth, because sales economics on this point is unambiguous. Acquiring a new business customer typically costs 5 to 7 times more than retaining an existing one, once you count sales calls, proposals, and the discounted pricing usually needed to win a first order. A $10 million branch losing even 10% of its customer base to churn in a single year is not just losing $1 million of revenue,
It is absorbing a disproportionate cost trying to replace it, at exactly the moment margin is already being squeezed by the shrinking market and the predator above it. Every awkward office relationship you are watching is, in the driest possible accounting sense, a customer retention subsidy paid in time instead of dollars, and it is one of the branch's only genuinely effective ones.
Now, look at what that retention strategy costs to staff. A branch this size typically runs somewhere around 15 to 25 office and sales staff, plus warehouse and delivery personnel. Salaries for a regional sales team in this category run, all in with benefits, somewhere around $50,000 to $70,000 per employee per year. Across 20 staff, that is roughly $1 to $1.5 million in annual payroll, which on a $10 million revenue base is already a double-digit share of the top line before a single truck has been fueled or a single ream has been bought from the mill. A regional manager overseeing this branch is not managing a paper business so much as managing a payroll that costs more proportionately than almost any other line on the sheet, in a category with almost no room to absorb it.
And salary is only part of that payroll figure, because health coverage for a small American employer is its own quietly enormous cost. Employer-sponsored health insurance for a staff this size typically runs $8,000 to $15,000 per employee per year on top of wages. Across 20 staff, that is another $200,000 to $300,000 a year, a cost with no direct connection to how much paper the branch actually sells, and one that rises most years regardless of the branch's own performance. A shrinking, thin-margin business absorbing a rising fixed cost that has nothing to do with its product is exactly the kind of quiet arithmetic that turns a merely difficult year into an impossible one, well before anyone in the branch has done anything differently at all.
Which tells you what the branch manager is actually paid to do. On paper, the job is sales targets and logistics. In practice, the manager's real function is retention and morale, keeping a workforce this size from turning over, in an industry where the product offers almost no career excitement, and the parent company is visibly, publicly, considering a corporate buyout at any time. Staff turnover in a role like this typically runs well above 20% a year industry-wide, and every departure costs the branch a recruitment cycle, a training period, and a temporary hit to the exact customer relationships the whole business model depends on. A manager who keeps this staff unusually stable, however unconventional the method, is defending the single most expensive and hardest to replace asset on the branch's books, which is not the paper and is not the trucks. It is institutional knowledge of who the customers are and why they still call.
Now widen the frame to the parent company, because the branch does not operate in isolation. A regional distributor of this size typically sits inside a larger corporate structure, several branches under one head office, and that structure exists specifically to negotiate better wholesale pricing and share back-office costs across locations. But a struggling regional paper company inside a declining category is also a natural acquisition target, and a corporate buyer's usual playbook is not investment, it is consolidation, merging overlapping branches, cutting duplicate staff, and centralizing the sales function into a call center that a national account manager can run from anywhere. A branch manager fighting to keep the office intact is not being sentimental for its own sake. He is fighting the single most predictable outcome for a small distributor in this category, which is being bought, stripped of its local staff, and folded into someone else's spreadsheet. Now, put the whole thing together, because this is where the real story is. Revenue, roughly $10 million. Margin, 3 to 6%. Call it $450,000 in a typical year. Payroll, $1 to $1.5 million. Already a heavier load than the branch's entire annual profit. Market decline, 2 to 4% a year. compounding against that same revenue base every single year the branch keeps operating, and a predator above it willing to sell at near cost to win the account. None of these numbers alone would sink a healthy company. Stacked together on a shrinking product in a low-margin trade, the arithmetic only works at all because of one variable that does not appear on any of these lines, which is whether the customers stay loyal to the people, not the paper.
Isolate that one variable and watch how much leverage it actually carries. If customer retention holds at a strong 95% a year, the branch loses roughly $500,000 of its revenue base annually to natural churn alone, replaceable at real cost through new sales. Drop that same retention rate to 85%, a 10-point fall that looks small on a slide, and annual churn nearly triples to $1.5 million, an amount the branch's entire annual profit cannot cover. At that lower retention rate, the branch is not shrinking, it is failing, slowly, in a way that looks for 2 or 3 years like ordinary market softness, before someone finally does the maths and realizes the branch has been running at an effective loss the entire time, paid for out of a shrinking cushion nobody remembered to keep watching.
And that arithmetic lands on real people, because a branch under this kind of pressure cannot simply absorb it quietly. Cost-cutting under margin pressure typically starts with the same 3 levers in the same order almost everywhere: hiring freezes, reduced benefits, and pay compression for the staff furthest from the executive floor. A sales rep who has spent a decade building the exact customer relationships keeping this branch alive is, in a downturn, often the very employee whose role looks most expensive on a consultant's slide, because loyalty and tenure show up as a cost line, not as the asset they actually represent. A rep let go after 10 years typically takes 18 months or more before a replacement rebuilds even half of the account trust they carried out the door with them. The employees who make the retention strategy work are structurally the first ones a cost-cutting review puts at risk, which is the quiet cruelty sitting underneath every stability metric this branch reports to head office.
So, map the actual flaw sewn into this business from day one. Dunder Mifflin's entire model rests on one asset: customer loyalty built through personal relationships. That does not appear as a line item on any balance sheet a corporate acquirer would read. Which means every cost-cutting review, every consolidation plan, every corporate buyout conversation is being run by people optimizing for the numbers that are visible: payroll, headcount, square footage, while the one number that actually determines whether the branch survives, the strength of its customer relationships, is invisible to the exact process deciding its fate. A branch can be cut for looking inefficient on paper, while being, in the metric that actually matters, the healthiest one in the company, and by the time anyone at head office realizes the mistake, the relationships that made it healthy have usually already walked out the door with the people who built them.
Price that blind spot the way a competent acquirer should. Every dollar of retained revenue this branch generates is backed by relationships held in specific people's heads, unwritten, uninsured, and non-transferable the moment those people leave. A corporate buyer who consolidates 2 branches and lays off the local sales staff is not simply cutting a cost, he is severing the exact connective tissue keeping the surviving branch's customers from switching to whichever competitor calls them next. And that severed connection typically shows up 18 to 24 months later as a slow, hard-to-diagnose decline in retention that nobody planned for and nobody can easily reverse. The founding assumption of every consolidation plan is that customers belong to the company. In a business built this way, they never did. They belonged to the person who answered the phone.
So close the book. Annual revenue, roughly $10 million, on a product category shrinking 2 to 4% a year for the foreseeable future. Margin 3 to 6%, producing $300,000 to $600,000 of genuine annual profit in a normal year. Payroll alone can exceed that entire profit figure, and a 10-point drop in customer retention can erase it several times over. Sitting above all of it, a national competitor willing to sell near cost, and a parent company for whom consolidation is always the mathematically obvious move. That is the real shape of the business, not a paper company, a fragile bundle of underpriced personal relationships wrapped around a shrinking commodity product that looks to anyone reading only the visible numbers exactly like a company that should be cut.
Convert it, and the picture sharpens further. A regional distributor generating $450,000 of annual profit in a category declining industry-wide would typically sell for somewhere between 3 and 5 times earnings, call it $1.5 to $2 million. That is a modest sum for an operation carrying $10 million of annual revenue, 20 employees, and decades of accumulated local relationships, a sale price under a fifth of 1 year's revenue. And the gap between those two numbers is exactly the point. The revenue looks respectable, the employees look replaceable on an org chart, but the relationships that actually justify the $10 million of sales are worth far more than the sale price captures, and worth precisely nothing to the acquirer the moment the people holding them are let go. The most valuable asset in the building has no line on the valuation at all.
So, should you buy Dunder Mifflin? On the numbers alone, this is a thin-margin business in a shrinking category, facing a well-funded predator and an obvious consolidation logic from its own parent company. Most acquirers, reading only the visible figures, would conclude the sensible move is to cut it. But the thing actually keeping this branch alive, every awkward relationship, every ordinary afternoon that looks like nothing is being accomplished, is the one asset a spreadsheet was never built to see. The lesson underneath this business is not really about paper, and it was never really about paper. It is that the most fragile, least visible, most easily dismissed line item in any company is very often the exact thing holding the rest of the numbers together, and the people optimizing a business for what they can measure are, more often than they realize, cutting the one thing they could never afford to lose.